Hey there! Welcome to this video on how to teach phrasal verbs. There are thousands of them in English, and they can be tricky for English language learners to understand and use correctly. But with the right approach and some practical tasks, you can help your students master phrasal verbs in no time. What are phrasal verbs? Phrasal verbs are a combination of a verb and one or more particles, prepositions or adverbs that often have a completely different meaning than the individual words. So, how do you teach phrasal verbs? It's not always the best idea to overwhelm students with long lists of phrasal verbs to memorize. Instead, choosing a small selection of phrasal verbs that fall into a logical group will make them easier to remember and incorporate into their vocabulary. One group of phrasal verbs to teach would be those with particle out. These phrasal verbs are often used in everyday English and can be useful for students to learn. Some examples of phrasal verbs with out are to find out, to stand out, to knock out, to die out. Another logical group of phrasal verbs to teach could be those with the same verb, for example, put, but different prepositions. Examples of phrasal verbs with put include put on, put away, put up with. You could create a phrasal verb pyramid to help students visualize and remember these phrasal verbs. If your students are willing to learn business English, you could choose a selection of phrasal verbs that are commonly used in business meetings. These phrasal verbs might include check in, follow up, hand in. By organizing these phrasal verbs into a topic, students will have an easier time remembering them and incorporating them into their business vocabulary. Another fun and practical group of phrasal verbs to teach could be those related to a specific topic. For example, food. Examples of phrasal verbs with food include to whip up, to cut back, to pick out, to dig in, to water down, and so on. By creating a visual aid that incorporates these phrasal verbs, students will have a better chance of remembering them. When teaching phrasal verbs, it's important not to rely solely on presenting students the definitions and the phrasal verbs themselves. This approach may not give them a clear understanding of how each phrasal verb is used in context. Yesterday, our company decided to take on a new project for one of our clients. In this context, take on means to accept or agree to do something, such as a new project. By using the phrasal verb in context, students will better be able to understand its meaning and how it is used in real-life situations. Now let's look at some activities to practice phrasal verbs. Matching activities. In a matching exercise where students match the phrasal verb to its definition, they benefit a lot. For example, you could give them a list of phrasal verbs like to look up, to take off, to run into, and so on, and then ask them to match each one to its meaning. This exercise will help them understand the different meanings of phrasal verbs and how they can be used in context. Gap filling is another effective way to teach phrasal verbs. Give your students a text with missing phrasal verbs and ask them to fill in the blanks with the correct words. For example, I'm sorry, I didn't what you said. Can you? This exercise will help them practice using phrasal verbs in a sentence and reinforce their understanding of meanings. Use picture prompts to help students practice using phrasal verbs in context. Show them a picture related to a certain topic and have them create a story or dialogue using the phrasal verbs related to that topic. For example, if you're talking about food, you could show a picture of a restaurant and have students create a dialogue between a waiter and a customer using the phrasal verbs related to food you have discussed before. Associations. Give a student a phrasal verb and ask them to make associations with it. For example, if the phrasal verb is take off, the student might associate it with flying, airplanes, or airport security. Encourage students to get creative and look for more personal and unique associations. Then, have them explain their choices. It helps students remember the phrasal verbs by linking them to different contexts. Action plans. Present a set of phrasal verbs to the student and ask them to imagine a scenario where they might use them. For example, if the phrasal verbs are run by, come across, figure out, the scenario could be a problem at work that needs to be solved. Have the student use the phrasal verb to describe the sequence of actions they would take to solve the problem. This activity helps students practice using phrasal verbs in context and creates a story-like structure that aids in memory retention. Storytelling. Give the student a set of phrasal verbs and ask them to make up a story that incorporates them. For example, if the phrasal verbs are break up, cheer up, get on, fall out, the story could be about a person who breaks up with their partner, gets cheered up by their friend, and gets on well with a new partner. Encourage the student to be creative and use phrasal verbs in interesting ways. This activity helps students practice using phrasal verbs in a narrative context and encourages them to use their imagination. Please find a list of useful websites to practice phrasal verbs with your students in the video description. Thank you for your attention. Good luck!